All right, let's run through the offense here. Very inexperienced quarterback situation. I guess Lincoln Keenholz would be the one guy that's thrown a couple passes. It's about 20 total in his career, mop up time, and very talented guys in Julian Sayin, of course, who's expected to win the job by most. Tavian St. Clair, of course, a true freshman. And as mentioned off the top, you're going to get a chance to talk to these guys this week. What are you looking to find out?
Well, I think just the growth. I talked to Lincoln Keenholz and Julian Sayin when we got full media days during the playoff run. But I think now, okay, you've shifted from being Will Howard's backups, being behind Devin Brown, for Lincoln Keenholz being behind Julian Sayin. Now you're in the competition. So what does that look like? What does that feel like for these guys? We were out at the first day of spring practice on Monday, got to see these guys throw some. We were there for about an hour. And Ohio State's doing the normal, okay, Lincoln Keenholz is the oldest guy, goes first, Julian Sayin, Tavian St. Clair. But then they're also doing situations where all three guys are throwing at once, which I thought was interesting and literally in a line. So you're able to kind of compare the throws as they happened. Impressive group. I'm going to be honest. Obviously, this is routes on air. There's no defense in these situations. There's no pressure on the quarterback. So they should be able to make these throws, right? But I think the pop that Julian Sayin has with his arm, I think is something that we noticed a year ago. And part of the reason he was so highly recruited. Lincoln Keenholz, in addition to being a great athlete and a guy who can do some things with his legs, I think you've started to see that development from him, at least, again, from the little bits we've seen. Even in some when we got to watch practice during the playoff run, you notice a guy that looks drastically different than the one who played in the Cotton Bowl a couple of years ago, albeit behind a very makeshift offensive line and didn't have any time. So I think right there you've got your true quarterback battle. Those are the two. I think Tavian St. Clair, we'll see if he can work his way into that, as Julian Sayin did by fall camp a year ago. But Tavian St. Clair, remember, comes from a very small school in Bellefontaine. I think as talented as he is, it'll probably take some time for him to adjust to the high level that Ohio State plays at, even practices at, once the Buckeyes put pads on and really start doing some things. So I'm not ruling him out of the competition, but I think Julian Sayin, Lincoln Keenholz, that's your battle. And as you said, Mark, I think everyone expects former 5-star quarterback and one of the top quarterbacks, one of the top prospects in the 2024 class, Julian Sayin, to win the job ultimately. But Ryan Day was asked, about, do you need to wait until fall camp? Because that's kind of been his MO. And he said, no, not necessarily. There's been times when guys have been further ahead and they've let them know that, but there's still a lot of football to be played in fall camp. And so it's hard to name a starter if there is true competition coming out of spring practice. I expect this to extend into fall camp as it has most years for the Buckeyes.
And as soon as I made the statement, I mentally checked myself because I remember Julian Sayin throwing a touchdown last year, which I just checked on. Yes, he went 5 for 12 with a touchdown pass. And Lincoln Keenholz, obviously, more significant time in relief of Devin Brown in the bowl game against Missouri. We got Pat Murphy here, Bucknuts, 247 Sports. That's the place to be to catch Pat's work, and you can catch him on X as well. And that's easy to find, as you see right there in the banner. The running back situation, wow, for as impressive as this group is, led by James Peoples, you got Bo Jackson, of course, C.J. Donaldson's a guy that's picked up a lot of experience and been fairly impressive, a pretty workmanlike back who's been successful at West Virginia in a couple seasons with some formidable production there, replacing Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. Good Lord, they're talking about Judkins possibly being a first-round pick at this point. That's a pretty sizable gap to try to make up.
Well, I think as we go through each position, if there's a guy departing, you're probably going to say the same thing, right? That's what happens when you win a national championship. But you're right. I mean, Ohio State made an effort last offseason to bring in Quinshon Judkins, pair him with Travion Henderson. Neither of them put up huge numbers during the season, but you saw the best of them, especially in the playoffs when they were fresh, when maybe other teams didn't have that kind of depth. And that's what Ohio State's looking for again. And I think, frankly, that will be the way that the Buckeyes try and shape the running back room going forward, having at least two that you can count on. And you mentioned James Peoples, you mentioned CJ Donaldson. Those are the two expected to be kind of stepping into the role of TreVeyon Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, not like for like necessarily, but certainly can do some different things. I think complement each other. We were watching CJ Donaldson just the other day at the first spring practice. Big boy, really big. But when I talked to Carlos Laughlin, the running backs coach, before the national championship game, he was talking about how that's a guy who you can throw the ball to. You can actually line. He was like, we could line him up in the slot. He's got good hands. He understands how to run routes. He's also shared the backfield for the last 2 seasons at West Virginia, which is why maybe if you just looked at his numbers, people may not be as impressed. He's used to splitting the workload. And, that wasn't the case for TreVeyon Henderson or Quinshon Judkins. Fortunately, it worked out well for the Buckeyes. Both guys were able to kind of set aside any ego for the betterment of the team. But this is a guy who knows how to handle a shared backfield. James Peoples, very talented. Buckeye fans got to see a little bit of him last season, scored a touchdown on his first career carry for Ohio State. I wrote about him earlier this offseason. Really impressive kid. And I think TreVeyon Henderson was the latest guy to make the comparison between James Peoples and J.K. Dobbins. For those who have maybe forgotten, J.K. Dobbins, the only Ohio State running back to rush for 2,000 yards in a season. And he did that in a more normal college football season with a Big Ten championship game and one college football playoff game as opposed to a 12-team playoff. So if James Peoples can live up to that comparison, I think Buckeye fans are going to be very happy. I like what I've seen from him. And if you're looking a little bit behind them, you mentioned Bo Jackson, Isaiah West, Anthony Turbo Rogers are the freshmen, but you also have Sam Williams-Dixon, who was a freshman last year for Ohio State, kind of the Curtis Samuel-like mold of being able to do some different things. He entered the transfer portal during the playoff run and then decided to come back to Ohio State. When we were watching, he was taking the third reps with the running backs. I will be very interested to see what his role is, because coming back to Ohio State, to me, it seems like, okay, let's figure out a way to get this guy on the field. Otherwise, I'm sure there were other teams that were interested in him. But you do have some talented freshmen, Bo Jackson being the one that I think stands out to most people. Already looks the part of a college back, even though he's only been in the program for a month or so. Obviously, the name carries some weight, right? Bo Jackson. But I think it will probably be mostly a 2-horse competition, even going into the season with the running backs. But I would not be surprised if one of these other guys potentially works his way into some sort of smaller role.
We talk to you Monday through Friday on our college football show, The College Football Show. It's Monday through Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Pat Murphy's here from Bucknuts breaking down Ohio State football. We're going through the offense today. And, typically there are polls out there and questionnaires concerning, what fans are most concerned with each offseason, whether that's in the spring or the fall. Well, if we went least concerned, I think we would go wide receiver. Pretty much for like 12 years in a row now. And they just, while it seems impossible to improve the wide receiver core, this school seems to do it somehow. Mecca Buka moves on, but with the emergence of a guy like possibly a Brandon Inniss in particular, or a Mylan Graham, we would expect this thing just to keep rolling. I don't know how much better Jeremiah Smith can get. And of course, Carnell Tate was... could have been a number one guy on 95% of the teams in the country.
It is a luxury that Ohio State has had, not only this year, not only last year, but as you mentioned, for several years here under Brian Hartline, even going back to Zach Smith. Jeremiah Smith looks already bigger, if you can imagine that. Ohio State posted a picture of him on social media where just like that kid is barely... He's not even done with his freshman school year, right? And you know what he did during the season. I don't know how you improve upon that, but Brian Hartline talked recently, the new Ohio State, newly promoted, I guess is what we're saying, even though he's had the title before, offensive coordinator and obviously wide receivers coach. The challenge will be getting Jeremiah Smith to take it to the next step. What does that mean? I don't know what you do, but he's a kid who works hard. I don't expect there to be any sort of buying into the hype. He's had plenty of hype throughout his career. Carnell Tate, you mentioned, that's a guy I think you could see take a big leap statistically this season. And you got kind of a preview of that in the Texas game when the Longhorns focused on taking Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka away. Well, Carnell Tate's pretty good. I think it was like 8 receptions for 79 yards or something along those lines. He can put up real numbers. I mean, this was one of the top receivers in the country coming out of high school. And then Brandon Inniss, that's a guy you expect to slot right in to the slot. The role of Emeka Egbuka vacated. He's a guy who's just waited his time patiently these last 2 seasons. Another guy who, had he wanted to, he could have hopped in the transfer portal, been a starter somewhere else, but has played his role, has made some important plays for Ohio State, both as a receiver and as a return man. But he will certainly have a much bigger role. Beyond that, we'll see if Brian Hartline goes any deeper, but you mentioned Mylan Graham. That's a guy who didn't arrive on campus until last summer, but a guy that they really like. Bryson Rogers is going into his 3rd year, somebody who could also help out in the slot. And, they've got some young guys coming in. I mean, it's quite the group of wide receivers that Brian Hartline has compiled once again. And you're going to miss Emeka Egbuka, no doubt. He is the all-time leading receiver in program history, but you just have the next guy stepping up, and that's the way it's been in that room.
By extension, Pat, we'll look at the tight ends. And, of course, G. Scott, he really finished off his career with a bang with some key plays in the playoff. We're looking at Jelani Thurman. Will Kazmarek caught 8 passes, of course, coming in from the MAC and Ohio University. But this Max Clare, I don't know what it is in regards to what's going on at Purdue, but they were probably the worst. They were the worst team in the country in power conference play. They were atrocious. They went 0-11, and it seems like everybody just picks apart that team, and they must have had like 5 NFL players, and everybody else was awful. But Max Clare was one of these guys who was an all Big Ten tight end despite playing for a horrendous Purdue team, and he may be a go-to this year.
It will be interesting to see what Ohio State does with a guy like Max Clare, because you mentioned G. Scott, who was a former wide receiver, really highly recruited wide receiver who transitioned to tight end and look, never put up big numbers in the Ohio State offense. Was an important part of the offense, especially last season. But when you even go back to a Cade Stover, the 2 years before that, like statistically, you don't look at those guys and be like, wow, right? Because mainly you have those wide receivers you can throw the ball to. You've got running backs you can give the ball to. So Ohio State's never needed like a Brock Bowers, for instance, where like, or a Tyler Warren for Penn State last year, where the tight end becomes a feature in their offense. But then you go and get a guy like Max Clare. Like clearly there is a plan there because, as you mentioned, an all Big Ten tight end, a guy who is probably more of a receiver than he is a blocker, similar to Jelani Thurman, who's going to enter his 3rd season in the program and should have an even bigger role this next year. So I'll be interested to see, only one football, right? You've got these receivers you want to get the ball to. We talked about the running backs. Where does a guy like Max Clare kind of fit in the pecking order of, not that you spend every play trying to get somebody the ball, but I imagine this is a guy who's going to want some catches, probably making a decent chunk of change from the NIL stuff. If he's not a great blocker, which based on watching him at Purdue, he has not been. Now, that doesn't mean it's not something that he can get better at. But an interesting addition by Ohio State, given that they haven't featured tight ends like other programs have. Will Kazmarek's a guy that I'm interested in seeing more of because he did get hurt in that Oregon game, missed several games, came back. I think he's definitely the number 2 tight end who will do a lot of the blocking stuff, but can still hurt teams if they don't pay attention to him. I mentioned Jelani Thurman. It's kind of getting to put up or shut up time. And that's not an insult to Jelani Thurman. That's more just he hasn't had an opportunity to get on the field. Bennett Christian, another guy who can do, kind of the nice blocking and can make some catches. So a number of bodies there. They've got some young guys as well. Again, only so many guys are going to play. But, you saw last year, I think those 3 tight ends and G. Scott, Will Kazmarek, and Jelani Thurman made for a nice group that did what Ohio State needed. And we'll see how that expands going into 2025.
On the Move is our recently launched recruiting and portal show that we do every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern time on our newly launched recruiting channel with Leanne Herring. And keep in mind, folks, that, she is delivering some top-notch commits and targets out there. So we got 2 more interviews today with 2 top 250 players for the 2026 recruiting class. So check it out Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern time. All right. If we went year by year, I talked about the offense or the wide receiver core not being a concern. I think the offensive line usually is the number one concern year after year after year after year. Well, let's, it's a national championship and other players, of course, get accolades and credit, but man, the offensive line was stellar throughout that run through the playoffs. Donovan Jackson made himself a boatload of money. There's no question about that. And Carson Hinsman coming back at center, and just there's quite a bit of experience coming back for this offensive line.
Agreed. I think you are in a better place than you were a year ago at this time when you're talking offensive linemen. There are some questions. You lost both starting tackles. So how do you replace them? Well, Ohio State's gone the transfer portal, got Ethan Onianwa from Rice, who will probably start at left tackle. Right. He was working with the twos on the first day of spring practice, but I imagine that will be your guy at left tackle. Philip Daniels from Minnesota, an interesting guy because he did start the last few games of the season at Minnesota, largely due to injuries. I've talked to a few people around that program, and there was some surprise that Ohio State was so interested in Philip Daniels. He is an Ohio kid from Cincinnati, not a guy Ohio State initially offered, but Minnesota thought he was certainly a guy who was going to start for them going forward, but probably a guy who still needed some development. And then he enters the transfer portal. Ohio State's heavy after him. Some may argue that he entered the transfer portal knowing that Ohio State would be after him. That seems to be the prevailing thought from those around the Minnesota program, that maybe there was some tampering there. I think that happens with a lot of guys, by the way. But so I'll be interested to see as we get to watch more, as we hear more about Philip Daniels, is he ready to be a starter at Ohio State at right tackle? Or, do you need to go to someone else who's been in the program and maybe seen some of that development a little bit more? And is there somebody who's ready? You could look at an Ian Moore, for instance, redshirt freshman, one of the Armstrong twins that are going to be in their second seasons. Carter Lowe is a true freshman. I think because there isn't an obvious answer, Philip Daniels is probably the guy, though we did see Austin Sareveld, who played guard all this past season, take the first team reps at right tackle at the first day of spring practice. But again, it is the first day. So certainly some questions at the tackle position. And then in the interior, Ohio State did that 3-man rotation with Luke Montgomery, Austin Sareveld, and Tegra Shabola at guard in the playoff. Is that something they continue? Does Austin Sareveld move to tackle full time? And then even Carson Hinsman, I think his best football was when he stepped in for Donovan Jackson, when Donovan Jackson moved to left tackle and he was playing left guard. Now, when he moved to center after Seth McLaughlin got hurt, it was good. There were still some snapping issues and some things at times. They have Josh Padilla, who is a young player that they really like, going to be entering his third year, same class as Luke Montgomery and Austin Sareveld, who was recruited to be a center. So is he ready to be the center? Do you stick with Carson Hinsman, who just helped you win a national championship? Is Carson Hinsman better as a guard? So yeah, while I think you feel a lot better about this offensive line group because of the experience you mentioned, some of the talent even, and we should mention Tyler Bowen, new offensive line coach after Justin Fry left. He'll have a new set of eyes, new thoughts about all this. So there are certainly some questions, but I do think talent-wise, experience-wise, you are in a better place than a year ago if you're Ohio State.